Hello and welcome to HMS Warrior. Now, doesn't she look beautiful in this sunset? Doesn't she look an absolute picture? I'm gonna hope you're gonna enjoy this video. I hope you're gonna enjoy it as much as I enjoyed going and recording it. I'm going to apologise now. There are some mic issues at a couple of points in some of the pre-recorded stuff that we did on site. That is entirely on me. I will not blame my camera lady / director in any way, shape or form. It's certainly not on her to check these things, and I would please like not to be killed. So, without much further ado, there are going to be the normal mixture of me chatting about slides from my office and stuff as well from visiting the ship. So, hope you're going to enjoy all the mixture, and thank you for watching. Now, HMS Warrior is always an interesting place to start when you are talking about Royal Navy ships, because HMS Warrior in many ways is as big a cut-off point as Dreadnought. Before her, you have a lot of half measures, a lot of ships which are edging there but not quite getting there. You even have the French, another power like the Italians and the Americans and various other powers were doing with the Dreadnought style battleship, pushing forward, trying to build something. And yet the British not only get there first, they get there best. Let's be honest, Warrior is the equal of everything which comes in for the next 7 or so years and is only really off frontline battleship service after 10 years. She has a status, she has a style, she has a capability. And she's the reason that we come up with the word, start using the word cruiser, because, well, when your frigate becomes your battleship, it can also be your cruiser. Although, interesting enough, she will also be a cruiser later on in life. That's what they will call her. They will call her a cruiser. The world of the 1850s has the Crystal Palace. It has all sorts of history going on, all sorts of things being created. It's a world of change, a world of development, a world of newness, really. But it's also a world of tradition. The wooden wall has held Britain's position firm for nigh on 30 years by this point. Yeah, there had been issues, yes. The end of the Napoleonic Wars is not as simple or as straightforward or as clear-cut as history will often try and be written to show. In fact, these things often cause issues and tensions for many years afterwards. And the Royal Navy's true dominance hadn't been won by war. That's a myth. War had given them the inkling of dominance. War had given them the status to propel them towards dominance. What had achieved dominance for them had been maintaining that position, had been ruthlessly investing and developing that position so that they didn't need to. Most importantly, that they didn't need to fight to have the dominance. Britain in the 1850s is in some regards, well, some respects, at its zenith in terms of being unassailable. Now, this is the problem, because from the 1850s onwards, various powers will start to rise up. Again, this is where you get into issues of mythology, because there are some people, and some of those people even write history books, and some of them are even actually would call themselves and have some justification to call themselves historians, but still believe that the world is so simplistic that for one power to rise, another must fall. The world is not like that. The world is not so simple. Thankfully, it's not so simple. The world doesn't need one to fall for another to rise. In fact, the one that's at the top can still keep rising. It's just rising at a slower pace and gets overtaken by the other. And often there is not a clear-cut successor until it happens. The amount of times in history nations have proclaimed themselves the rightful heir, the new power, the one that's going to rule the world from now on, and have fallen flat. France thought it would take over from Spain. It was Britain. The Dutch were major powers, but they were knocked out, and the running was a multi-horse race for much of the time. Germany, at many times, thought it was going to take over from Britain. It was America. Soviet Union thought it was going to take over from America. Soviet Union fell. America still kept going. You can go further back if you want. You can look through the history. There are... Well, how do I put this politely? Julius Caesar was right when he, to paraphrase him, declared that the second position in Rome was the most dangerous position to be in. As a nation-state, being the second most powerful is definitely the most dangerous position to be in. Because everyone is coming for you, and it's none of the pressure of going for the number one. None of the pressure. So, we've got a world which has constant technological changes, which is going from being relatively peaceful with absolute dominance assured by inertia as much as anything else, and suddenly there is change. And that change could potentially confer advantage. That change could theoretically upend the scales of power as were understood and established already. Now, the Royal Navy of this world, of the 1850s, is an organization which is sufficiently compromised that it is honestly consistently in trouble. Now, I do not mean that it's compromised in the fact that it's going to be easy to fight or easy to beat, but as I've discussed in other videos, there is a consistent issue for a nation in this sort of flux, this scenario. You have to invest money in your navy, but you probably don't want to invest that much, especially politicians of this period don't want to invest that much. This is the prima laissez-faire age, after all. And so you have a choice. What to invest your money for your navy in. There's also the fact that this has been yes, there's been some activations for Crimea and all sorts of incidents going on through the years, but honestly, there hasn't been a major war for the Royal Navy to get, for want of a better phrase, blooded in. And that has an impact. It means everyone who's been promoted up has been promoted up based on experience and do they fit? Do they do the job right? You know, da-da-da-da-da. That's the trouble. When you have... What do you have in this period? Can you do fake firing of shells in order to hit a target? Or, Load up with dummy cannonballs, fire them. Well, you don't really have paint cannonballs that you can fire at other ships to test your firing capabilities. So it's quite a lot of theoretical. Yes, you can have some targets that occasionally are towed and you blast away at, but those are crude things. And usually they are boats with just boats being used. Sails suspended above them. And even that is not really a common thing and is not done a lot of it. And look at this. This is a battleship built not a long time before Warrior. This is HMS Agamemnon. Yes, a rather appropriate name. Named for, after all, one of Nelson's own ships. She had been the first British shipper line to be designed and built from the keel up with steam power. Yeah, she's amazing. Her armament was full of muzzle-loading smoothbore cannon. Yeah, those were still the key thing. She had 91, broadly speaking. 34 8-inch 6500 weight guns on the gun deck. 34 32 pounder, that's 5600 weight guns on the main deck. And 22 32 pounder, 4500 weight, and a single 68 pounder 9500 weight gun on the upper deck. Yeah, she means business. And before you think, oh well, this must be launched a long time before HMS Warrior, no, this vessel is laid down in the 1850s, launched in 1852, paid off in 1862 and out of service in 1870. She was ordered in 1849. Warrior would be laid down in 1859, launched in 1860, completed in 1861. In simple terms, there is roughly a little over 8 years, and we're talking a couple of months over 8 years, between the launching of this ship and the launching of Warrior. Now, admittedly, Warrior had a beautiful, beautiful propeller that it theoretically took all 600 men to lift up. Crew requirements. Well, we're definitely sure we've got enough crew for everything we want to do. How? Because we're having to carry 700 of them. Why? Because at least 600 of them will have to be needed to lift the propeller up when we want to go full sailing and as smooth as possible for sailing, because believe it or not, we understand drag. We want to lower down our funnels and bring up our propeller, and then we're all sails ahead. The world just gets more and more interesting as we get older. Then comes the Gloire. Now, the Gloire, well, in the nicest way, the Gloire is probably not the ship they wanted it to be. It really isn't. The Gloire was thought of going to be so many things to the French. It was, her and her sisters were supposed to be these things which were going to take back the glory. They're designed by Henry Dupé de Lhomme. That wonderful, wonderful iconoclast of the Je ne Colle movement. Let me just check I used iconoclast right. I'm worried I might be being too generous to him. Basically, he spends his entire life attacking everything to do with conventional naval warfare in support of the Junicole, yeah. Iconoclast. That's polite. It's far nicer than the other words which were going around my head. And yes, this ship, which I feel sorry for every time I look at it, is what he comes up with. She was reported to have 13 knots of speed. Our records suggest she never attained more than 11 and 3/4 knots, and her operating records suggest that 11 knots was the practical maximum, and that was if they were really, really pushing it. And Warrior's speed was 14 knots. Warrior was bigger. Basically, this is a ship which is being built as a way to try and achieve first pass status at sea on the cheap. And I can tell you two things of history, which there are very few things in history which are guaranteed lessons for the future. History can provide you with guidelines and things you can use as reference points, touchstones to make decisions with. But it rarely produces things which are actual solid things you can base your information on. But I think there is one fairly consistent theme. If you are trying to go for the first place in anything, it isn't going to be cheap, it won't be easy, and it certainly won't be quick. And if you're trying to achieve all three at once to get first place, you are probably going to end up with, well, I would say egg on your face, but that seems again too kind an image. I would say undercooked omelette on your face. Far worse than egg on your face. Far, far worse. But no, she was a nice little ship for what she was, which was a 36-gun frigate, really. She had some rifle muzzle-loading guns, the 164mm 6.5-inch ones, as built. After 1868, she went up to the 6 9.4-inch guns and 2 7.6-inch guns. Honestly, when I look at her, and I do look at her a lot, I just look at the class and go, sorry. Her and her sisters, and she had 3 sisters. Again, I have to admit, there is one good thing about these classes, is that whereas Dreadnought is produced solo, Warrior comes along with Black Prince, and Gloire came along with Invincible and Normandy. Normandy actually saw the most action of any of them, supporting the French intervention in Mexico in 1862. She became the first ironclad to cross the Atlantic, and so could be argued to have introduced the idea of ironclads to the North American continent, although I'm fairly certain some people who are fighting a civil war to the north of Mexico might disagree with that statement. I feel that might have a slight Franco bias. Just a small one, from the historian who said that. Just a small Francophone bias. But she saw... none of them saw any action in the Franco-Prussian War. And, well, here's how you can tell they were built on the cheap, right? Only Gloire was built with seasoned timber. Only Gloire. She was broken up and condemned in 1879, though. Her sisters only managed a decade before they were too rotten for any further use and condemned in 1871 and 1872. There is a very big difference between the ship, and let's go back to her, that the French build, and the ship the British supposedly build to deal with this apparent challenge. This is built, one of the classes built with seasoned timber. And even shears. And then the other two are built with stuff which rots very quickly. Very, very quickly. And here is the other advantage the British have, because they build so many ships. This is HMS Mersey, by the way. She's what Warrior is based on. Oh yes, because Warrior's architect was not a stupid man. Isaac Watts was the chief constructor of the Navy. He had designed all sorts of ships, built all sorts of ships, been responsible for all sorts of ships. And frankly, if anyone can bring the stuff together, it's going to be him. And he immediately goes, right then, so I'm bringing a whole load of technologies together. I'm going to pick one of the most reliable yards I can find, which I'm going to talk a lot more about later when we get to the engines. And B, I'm going to pick a design I know well. And the Mersey is exactly that. If we consider the stats of the Mersey, she was 102.64 meters overall. She was 5,643 tons in displacement, 3,733 tons in burthen. She'd been built at Portsmouth Dockyard. Again, laid down 1856, launched 1858, completed 1859. Built at Chatham Dockyard, completed at Portsmouth Dockyard. She's one of the ones that gets moved around. She has a 1,000 shaft horsepower auxiliary steam engine, as well as sails, as a primary. Top speed 13.29 knots. Endurance 145 hours at full steam. A complement around 600. And 40 guns. 12 on the upper deck, 28 on the main deck. Okay. Then let's consider the Warrior. Well, the Warrior is total 9,284 tons in full displacement. 128 meters. Okay. So it's bigger. The beam of the Mersey is 16 meters. The beam of the Warrior is 17.8 meters. The draft of the Mersey is 8.8 meters. The draft of the Warrior is 8.2 meters. She has 5,267 indicated horsepower installed. Please note, indicated, not shaft. Top speed 14 knots. Range of 2,100 nautical miles at 11 knots on the engines. And 26 smoothbore guns. 10 rifle. 4 rifle breech loading, 10 rifle breech loading 110 pounder guns, and 4 rifle breech loading 40 pounder guns. So a total of 40 guns. So he's taking a whole design he already knows and scaling it up and adding in the necessary accoutrements, all the things they've already tried out. The armouring, all the engine power, all the structuring they've already tried out, he's got. And that's what he's building. The response to the Gloire. Britain's first 2 ironclads. And by the way, they are built of seasoned wood. They are very well seasoned wood. And again, this is an advantage the British have, because what do they have? Huge stockpiles of timber. Absolutely colossal stockpiles of timber. Warrior is built at Thames Ironworks, so not that far from the London head offices of the Navy, the Admiralty. And Black Prince is built by Robert Napier at Govan in Glasgow. Now, during their construction, they had a lot of work done. They could have actually been probably built quicker. But this meant there were changes in the construction, delays in the construction. For example, the gun ports were originally built to be 46 inches, that's 1.2 meters wide, which would allow the 68-pounders to transverse 52 degrees, allowing you to have a far wider degree of fire. You weren't just firing straight at a target, you could angle to better hit them. While the ships were being built, though, a thing called a directing bar, which consists of an iron bar that fastens to a pivot bolt in the sill of the gun port, was developed. This led to the gun carriages being modified, as this allowed them to pivot much closer to the gun port than had previously been possible, which meant that the gun ports, and consequently, important for your total area of armour coverage, the gun ports could be narrowed, which would give you far more protection, as it would make the holes in your armour that much smaller. In fact, the guns ports could be reduced down to a width of 24 inches. And which of course is a difference. Now, the gun ports were narrowed by basically armour being 7 inches of raw iron being added in at various points. And they also decided to modify the armour plates with tongue and groove joints so as to lock the plates together because of the way the arm was going to be structured. I'll be getting into this later. Which they started off by not doing, then decided, hey, we will do that. And so they had to take off the armour they already put on and change that arm and reforge it to make it fit. And the idea was this would increase their resistance to armor-piercing shells. And this is why Warrior ends up taking a year longer to complete than she'd be contracted to take. Think about that. Warrior is laid down in 1859, launched in 1860, and completed in 1861. May 1859, December 1860, and October 1861. And she takes a year longer than she's supposed to. So she's supposed to have been completed by October 1860, broadly speaking. I doubt it would have been October 1860, even if everything had gone to plan. I'm sorry. I sincerely doubt a new ship like this would have been completed on time. But that's what they were hoping for. That would have been very interesting. But if she had been, that would have been a very big flex by the British, being able to build such a ship so quickly. That, remember, is what the British have been doing to maintain their status for the last 30-odd years by the time she comes into service. 30, 40 years by the time actually Warrior comes into service, because they have been flexing based on their infrastructure, based on the capabilities they have. Which makes sense. She is built by the Thames Ironworks and Shipbuilding Company. Now, I have done a little bit of overlay here, so please note that there is Google Maps beneath this older map. But basically, the idea is, if you look very closely at this image, you should be able to see Bow Creek, which is not far from Victoria Docks, which is not far from the Excel Centre in London. Now, today, if you go there, and I do say, if you go to those docks, you will find, not far away from where HMS Warrior, I think, roughly was built, you will find a Holiday Inn Express. So, there is also a few other places there. I think there is a railway station a bit further up, Canning Town Station, not that far away, which has got both a railway line and DLR, if I remember correctly. But yes, as I understand it, and reading and looking at the old maps and trying to work it out, the slipway, etc., where it was, I think, broadly speaking, you're looking at roughly where the Holiday Inn Express is. Now, to be honest, the rivers have been moved around. There's been all sorts of work done in there area a bit, and these things are probably a little bit off. But yes, if you go to the Holiday Inn Express, you are staying where Warrior was built. And the Thames Ironworks and Shipbuilding Company was a very interesting company. They had a lot of experience, even by this time. They had been founded in 1837. And they had been founded from other works which had been going on there. They produced ironwork for Brunel's Royal Albert Bridge over the Tamar in the 1850s. And as ironwork goes, considering how recently ironwork had come about, they were considered one of the best. They had financial issues because they kept investing in new technologies, and those technologies didn't always pay off. Furnaces and rolling mills that could construct vessels of 4,000 tons were a useful system. But when most of the ships you're building are less than 1,000 tons, you are going to have trouble justifying that cost. Unless you've got a lot more throughput than they actually achieved. By 1855, they had 3,000 employees. And they had a serious problem. They had a serious problem. Because Charles Mayer, who was running it at the time, was not good at getting companies to pay for completed work. And they also kept undercalculating the costs of building ships for the Royal Navy, which is something you should never do. It gets you to contract. Oh yeah, it does. But the Royal Navy are not the type of organisation which will then go, and this period go, oh, you overspent and you've come back with a bill. We will of course give you money. No, they're the organisation which goes, we have contract. But it's cost more money to deliver what you asked for. But we specified that in contract. But it's cost more money. But we have contract. It says this price for this. This is what we've asked you to do. This is what you've done. This is what we agreed to pay you. But it's cost more. This is what we agreed to pay you. But what we agreed to pay you. Now, do you need me to get a Sergeant Major of the Royal Marines to explain this to you in words of one syllable? No, I do not need a Sergeant Major of the Royal Marines. Good. Now, Jenkins, no biscuits are needed. Eventually, they are taken over. And everything is transferred into a new limited company with new people running it, who are, how do I put this? content to leave the key engineers and the works managers in charge. Joseph Webster, Robert Bailey are left in charge running it because they are very good engineers. But Mayor's father-in-law, Peter Rolt, who's a timber merchant and a descendant of the Pett shipbuilding family, manages to put in all sorts of people to actually do the finances, so that Mayor isn't the one trying to get the money out of people. For example, as one of the company directors, they get a gentleman called Lord Alan Spencer Churchill. Now, Lord Alan Spencer Churchill, has some interesting relatives, including his brother being the grandfather of Winston Spencer Churchill. So you can guess which family he comes from. And whilst he did eschew a political career and instead chose to go into business, he had the right connections and the right abilities to make sure that those people remembered to pay their bills. It's useful. When you're having to deal with ministers in the House of Lords, it's very useful. It's very useful to be able to go and talk to them as a fellow lord, lord to lord, and explain to them that whilst the nice men of the merchant class might ask for the bills to be paid and you might be able to get away with it, dodging them by being very lordly. I am a fellow lord. And I'm fairly good with a sword. Not that we do dueling at this time anymore, do we? You're going to remember to pay your bill, aren't you? So nice. And as for dealing with the Admiralty, well, raise your prices a bit. And remember, they do stick to the contract. They do not understand the concept of, you want more money? At various points, they do actually have to give them. And actually, during the construction of HMS Warrior, because the company almost goes bankrupt and the Navy's worried about it, it's £50,000. But that actually is given by the government to the shipbuilder. But that money is given. There are so many strings attached to that money. So many strings. But yes, if you want to go see where HMS Warrior is built, there isn't anything really there left anymore. But there is a Holiday Inn Express, I think. I think that's what it was. Let me check. I hope it's not a travel lodge, and I've been calling it a Holiday Inn Express the whole time. No, it's a Holiday Inn Express. Into the back of HMS Warrior. Now, this is a 110-pound breech loading rifled gun. It is designed to provide cover for HMS Warrior at the rear. Now, to do this, you of course want the gun to be able to fire at many angles, but this is pre the turret age, and this is an age where you need to move things around quite literally by manpower. Now, this is a piece of fiberglass reproduction, which is probably sensible because it's probably a lot more movable than the actual iron and steel construct that would have been here originally. But if you look down, you will see there are a load of tracks. And these tracks are what they would move the gun around on. And while they were doing that, and probably getting fired at, there'd be a group of about 8 people standing up here at the wheel, trying to take directions from the people up on the bridge, so named because it is literally a bridge, to steer the ship in the direction they want to go. Now, sometimes they get it right, sometimes they get it wrong. Usually they get it right. But this is a very, very big construct to get the people to go around and to get the ship to move. And all the time, while there's firing going on, while people are literally shouting down orders or trying to do a hard in to hold directions with hand signals, which is is a lovely idea and works really, really well, right up until you have the steering position surrounded by the guns which are firing and being fired upon. Small issue once you get to the ironclad frigates. It's just a small issue. You'll have the people up there. They will be giving the orders. They will be shouting instructions down and trying to make sure everything is going to plan. I'm going to start off slightly differently than I recorded it. I recorded from the top down because we had an hour's filming time before anyone got in. It was very, very kind of the Portsmouth Historic Dockyard and the lovely people at the Warrior Trust to let us in, and they did. They were so kind and so helpful. But I knew that if we went over, and because they're nice, we might go over, it would be a lot easier to do, go over and manage it, if the members of the public were not in my way. And because of the way you enter the ship from the top and work your way down, if I did that direction with the filming, that meant the public would be behind me and wouldn't probably be in my filming. That's the idea. That's how it worked. But I'm not going to be doing the videos in that order. Or rather, I'm going to be doing some of them in order, but I'm actually going to be doing the engines first, because the engines are a really cool part, and I really love talking about them. The engines produced for HMS Warrior are absolutely critical, and they come from John Penn & Sons, a company which had been founded in 1799, continues on to 1899 when it combines with Thames Ironwork Shipbuilding Engineering Company, with the Thames Ironwork people, the people who built the Warrior. John Penn & Sons, how do I describe them? In their period, and certainly for certain periods between roughly the 1840s to the 1870s, they're the Rolls-Royce of their day when it comes to engines. They are literally the go-to company. His starts, as said, in 1799. One of the earliest engines produced was a Grasshopper beam engine. He then started to focus on marine engines and produced a 40 horsepower beam engine which were fitted in paddle steamers, Ipswich and Suffolk. And then started producing oscillating engines, from the version painted by a gentleman called Aaron Manby in 1821. In 1844, he replaced the engines of the Admiralty yacht HMS Black Eagle with oscillating engines of double the power without increasing either the weight or the space occupied. Now, this was critical because this is, up to this point, the companies which had dominated naval supply of engines were Boulton and Watt and Maudslay, Son and Field. John Penn & Sons at this point takes over. He then introduced trunk engines for driving screw propellers, and HMS Encounter in 1846, Aragon in 1848 were the first ships to be fitted with engines. These engines were so efficient that by the time Penn died in 1878, the engines had been fitted in 230 ships. Now, he is the second generation of the company. The company was originally started by his father, who was also John Penn. And there are lots of Johns in this family, and they're all called John Penn. So please, just go with John Penn. Just consider them immutable, interchangeable. It works. For the concept of this, for the level of the necessity information we need to go to into this video. In 1851, remember I mentioned the first specifically designed as steam screw vessel, well, steam screw auxiliary, HMS Agamemnon, was fitted with a Penn engine. Yes! Which meant that Penn became the critical supplier. He would go on to develop lignum vitae stern bearing which enabled the screw propeller ships to make oceanic voyages without wearing their stern glands. He did some work with a gentleman called Francis Pettit Smith. And he also started to develop superheated steam in marine engines. And, as you can see, was critical to gunboat production. And by the way, if anyone is in the Western Australia Museum, or near it, in Perth, you will find in there an engine recovered the wreck from the SSS Xantho, which is one of the gunboat type engines. And it was assembled, we think, in 1861. And was recovered intact with all its fittings and fixtures, including Penn's nameplate. So I am currently very jealous, and if, as planned, I make it to Australia next year, that is one of the things I'll be going to go see. Anyway, now it's time for me to take you on a tour of boilers, engines and power, which honestly turn me into a very tall, slightly rotund, needing to spend more time at the gym, 6-year-old. I think that's what we'll call it in the defined terms, but please, enjoy. So, welcome to a space which people often rush past when they come to HMS Warrior, and I always love it. Because whenever I bring students here, they rush down these steps, and they go straight into there to see the engine room. And they miss this bit. If you look down here, you can actually see the outer hull, and beyond that is the water of Portsmouth Harbour. And that shows you the way the hull is constructed, how the iron is riveted in place and how it's held with the framing. And it's a really cool piece of engineering. But of course, where are they trying to rush to go? Into here. They're rushing in here, sadly enough not to see the railway, which can allow you to move coal around. Yes, this has a little version of its own sort of monorail system, but it's between rails, but it's from above, so sort of monorail style. These are some of the boilers. These are some of the boilers. They are what keep this ship going and allow it to achieve the speeds it does under power. If you can imagine, there would be almost an incessant rattle of these coal bunkers going around, being taken around full of coal, and men shoveling the coal into the boilers. Especially when you're going for higher speeds, that shoveling would be almost constant. There would be an almost incessant case of coal in, the whole time going on to try and keep the ship going. Because these boilers are, as beautiful as they are, as high-tech as they are for the time, incredibly inefficient. They are incredibly inefficient. So to get anything out of them, you really need to stack in the coal. You really need to give them the power. But when you do get them, well, they of course heat the water, and that moves the steam along the pipes. But you need a lot of boilers, and a lot of coal. And even to this day, it's still leaking oil, which is probably good because it means it's still working. And this is where the coal would come out from. This is where you would have the coal boxes with 156 tons, and these are the little sort of trucks. The coal be brought out to here on to be loaded in and taken around. Because the coal had to move in such quantities, you needed to move it with assistance. You couldn't move it all by hand. And still, everything's building up and heading in this direction. It's all heading along here. Why is it heading this way? Why is the steam coming this way? So, without much further ado, let's start going around the ship, shall we? I think that's enough back. So this is where all that power is going. This is where it comes to. This is the real fun. These engines are where all that steam, all that coal, all that effort, all that sweat, blood, tears and water get turned into power. And this is where the ship really comes to life. Because the other secret of an ironclad frigate is, yes, it's got sails, it's got sailors, it's got everything you want to move by the traditional methodology. But when other ships get becalmed, this thing can keep on going. When other ships are having trouble steering because of currents and wind, it can keep on going because it has its own power. It has these. It has all of this. And it's all controlled by these wheels. It's all controlled by systems which look very rudimentary and require a lot of love and care and understanding. The engineers on a ship, the other reason they were separate was because each ship was so individual, the engineers had to become, well, pretty much get a PhD in that ship to be able to run it. Every boiler system is unique. Every one of these engines is a unique construct. They're beautiful. They're powerful. They're wonderful. They have all these great emotions going on, but most importantly, all these great actual things being done with them. But they are delicate as anything, because every single one of them is a one-off. None of them are replicable. We're in an age where the guns are getting replicable, where they're trying to machine things, where they are trying to make things as standardized as they can be, and yet still, these pinnacles of engineering of time are as individual as you can get. As mentioned earlier, those 10 rectangular boilers, those engines, the trunk steam engine, developed 5,772 indicated horsepower. That's what they did. And they gave the Warrior a top speed of 14 knots, or a range of 2,100 nautical miles at 11 knots, which is not bad. Not bad at all. And when she gets there, of course, she's going to be turning up quite well armed. Well, on paper. Now, HMS Warrior carried a lot of capability when it came to firepower, especially in theory, possibly not so in practice. But, for example, she carries the ability to fire molten shells. Anything new and going in terms of shells, cannonballs, they tried out on Warrior. This was really a ship which was being used to push the edge of the envelope technologically in the 1860s. And her weapons break down to the old, tried, true and tested 68-pounder, which pretty much is a variation on the same guns which have been built by the Royal Navy for the last 200-odd years by this point. Yes, this was developed under Colonel William Dundas, and yes, it's designed in probably 1846. He was Inspector of Artillery, 1839 to 1852, so in about the middle of his career. It was a cast-iron smoothbore, loaded from the muzzle, and it cost roughly £167 to be built, according to the Royal Commission on Defence in the United Kingdom at the time. So it's the cheap, cheerful, we can churn this out en masse. It's what the British had won several wars with. They knew this gun. They knew it in every single form. It could fire solid shot, explosive shells, grape shot, case shot, and Martin's liquid iron shell, which were thin-walled shells filled with molten iron intended to serve as heated shot. How? I have to say, this is one of the reasons why, when pointing out different types of shells, which I'll do later on HMS Warrior, when looking around, I don't give their name inscriptions of which is which, because they only have 4 they show. And by some of my maths, I think she would have been carrying about 6 times the types of shot for the cannon, and probably 4 or 5 for the other guns as well. So she's going to be carrying a whole range of ammunition, and that stuff is very much representative of the mixture and how it will be stored. Not necessarily all that was there. But the actual guns themselves, well, we have the 40-pounder, the Armstrong gun, which is the very successful breech-loading gun developed by Armstrong, it does really well. It's really good. It works perfectly with his breech loading system. Everything's fine. And it's 1,000 versions of his built. The other breech loading gun is when he decides to scale up a 40-pounder to a 110-pounder in order to provide him with something which is going to be just as good. Turns out to not be as good. And honestly, there are some interesting reports. I could go straight to a political one, but I'm going to go to the account of Euryalus. At the bombardment of Kagoshima in August 1863. We had on our main deck 32-pounder 5,600 weight muzzleloaders, and they of course gave no trouble. In the forecastle we had a 7-inch BL 100 breech loading, rifle breech loading technically, 110 pounder Armstrong. Whether the men in the heat of action became hurried I cannot say, but certain is that the breech piece of this gun blew out with tremendous effect, the concussion knocking down the whole gun's crew. And apparently paralysing men. Until Webster, captain of the forecastle and of the gun, roused them shouting, "Well, is there a... or of you will go and get the spare vent piece?" I won't repeat what he actually said. This was a letter from an officer of Eurus to William Laird Clowes, a prominent historian, a few years after the event. And a further piece from that appeared in the Times on 25th April 1864. My opinion, and also that of the gunnery lieutenant, is that for long range, they, Armstrong guns, are most successful. 100-pounder as a pivot gun is superior to the 95 weight solid 8-inch gun, but as broadside guns between decks we do not like them. The smoke is too great, rear choke carriages with such heavy guns are very slow in working, and the decks dreadfully cut up. The common shell is one of its great efficiencies. The bursting charge is so great at Kagoshima, one vent piece of the pivot gun broke and a piece went up to the foreyard, but no one was hurt, and it was the fault of the captain of the gun not putting the tin cap in. If the gun is understood and worked properly, it is very successful. However, even Armstrong himself says this to the politicians. The threatening aspects of the continent require that large rifled guns should be procured for naval and siege purposes. Okay. I was therefore called upon to produce 40-pounders and 100-pounders without having had an opportunity of testing the patterns by previous trials. Though I had stated in my original report that I apprehended that the application of breech loading to large guns would involve an application of parts which would be inconveniently heavy to handle, I was at first in hopes that the same material which had been used and found to be sufficient for the 40-pounder would be found equally suitable for the 100-pounder. But that turns out to not be the case. This is a big surprise to me. A gun which is much bigger, much bigger, let's be honest. It turns out the same materials which can hold the pressures of a 40-pounder can't manage the pressures of a 110-pounder. I am surprised that Sir William Armstrong was surprised, knowing the quality of engineer that Sir William Armstrong was. In fact, I am very surprised he was surprised. But that turns out not to be the case. The vent piece for the 100-pounder continues still to be a difficulty. This is what he said to the Select Committee on Ordnance in 1863. The same committee then later on reports, the preponderance of opinion seems to be against any breech loading systems for the larger guns. Amazingly, some people, though, seem to think it wasn't the gun which is necessarily the problem, or rather, the idea of a breech loading gun. My objection has been to the Armstrong breech loader. My objection to that is that the breech plug is only a valve, and the first principle of every valve, whether the vessel contained water or oil or gas, is that the pressure on that fluid should press the valve tighter. Now, Sir William Armstrong's breech loader is on a diametrically opposed system. Nothing there confines the gas but the actual amount of labour expended in screwing up of the breech. If the gas is stronger than the man, aided by the screw, the gas will escape. In simple terms, that breach is the problem. The way the screw system is worked is the problem, not the idea of a breech loader. Well, therefore you can say the breech loader is a problem because you don't have a system to make that work. But as we know, people soon do develop systems which do make these breaches a lot stronger. But what is to be known is that whilst Warrior goes to sea with these guns, with the breech loaders, as her career goes on, it's, let's put it this way, she does have ebbs and flows of these guns being part of her armament. In fact, like many ships in the period, the British end up focusing on muzzle loaders for a while as they develop better breech loaders, and quite a lot of ships find their number of breech loaders go down in favour of the muzzle loaders, which are less likely to kill crew. But still, please go look around the deck, it's really cool. This is a really good position to see the different types of shot carried aboard HMS Warrior. You have the red balls, you have the red capped shells, you have the black balls, and you have the black capped shells, which are sort of over here. Each one has a different purpose and is a different part of the ship's armament. And it's really important, and one of the reasons why they're color coded is to make it easier to find the right one in action. So, much the same as you do aft, forward, you have this lovely arrangement. You have all these spaces and all these systems in order to be able to maneuver this gun around. Now, it will still get free and squash tows and occasionally kill people if it's moving too fast. But the point is, you can fire it there, 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 or theoretically from here if you really want to lose your bowsprit. If you really want to lose all of this bit forward, you can fire it this direction. For some reason, no captain ever wanted to do that. I cannot think why. Now, one of the key things for being able to do this are these locking points you can see in the floor. To being able to maneuver between the locking points and lock in the gun, or rather lock in its carriage. But still they need to deal with the recoil of the gun, which is why they have this structure set up. So it will slide backwards and forwards on the carriage, rather than the deck. So consider this more as a bit of mobile decking than really a carriage as we put on the side. Now, we've looked at weapons, let's look at the defences. Remember this?
Go!
Hello and welcome to HMS Warrior. Now, before you get to her, there's always this wonderful piece of history you can walk past, which is an example of her armour, of how she's built. You have the iron plates. You have 3 of them, which provide with the outer protection. And these plates are bonded onto this wonderful stuff. This is teak. It's as strong as you can imagine. And it's here because when the armour gets hit by hard shot, what happens is bits of iron will spool off and they'll slam into the crew and kill you just as well as if there's no armour there. So you have this teak backing because that will absorb the bits that come off the armour, and then hopefully it'll keep your crew alive. So the armour is a full composite system of teak and iron, of your surface face hardening as you'll have on later steel armour, and of the system which will absorb the energy. Now, HMS Warrior's design is very simple. I already mentioned the fact that they use a tongue and groove system to try and keep the iron armour plates overlapping. But basically, the entire armour system is made up of 3 plates. There was a maximum thickness that you could roll at the time. And so to get a wrought iron belt, armour belt of 4.5 inches thickness, it's actually made up of 3 sets of armour, each 1.5 inches thick. And they're all set to overlap and interlock, so that it makes into a far stronger overall. And then it's backed up by this. 18 inches of teak. 2 sections, each 9 inches wide. Again, overlapping. And done in such a way to give them support, to give them strength. The teak is at right angles. And basically the idea was, as I've mentioned in the whole discussion, but do realise bits don't come through as well. The mic worked. Occasionally you see the mic sticking out, and occasionally it works, and occasionally it doesn't. I'm still getting used to it and doing the recordings with it. And sometimes it seems to work better with the DJI camera than, and sometimes it works better with the phone camera, and I have no idea why. I'm still working out, so apologies for that. But basically, the idea is you have all these systems overlapping, right angles in various ways, in order to provide the strongest mix, the strongest composition to resist the impact. And the idea is very much that the armour would take the blow. But by transmitting the energy through the teak, it would spread it, but also dampen it. So that the bolts, etc., connecting the armour to the hull wouldn't be broken, and it would actually make it, well, at the time, they did some testing at Sheerness, and they found it, well, no, not Sheerness, Shoeburyness, sorry, practically invulnerable to the ordnance at the time in use. Now, the armour is important, and I'm going to use a phrase to discuss it in a second, which I'm going to call it an armoured citadel. Because really it is one of the first ships which really has a proper citadel construction as we'd understand it. Where it does literally have this sort of armoured box in the middle, which has a bow and a stern tucked on. Because the armour, well, the iron plates are 3 foot by 12 foot plates. And as I said, there are 3 layers of those. The armour coverage, well, it was over the middle, 213 feet. That's 64.9 metres of the ship, and extended 16 foot, 4.9 metres above the waterline, and 6 foot, that's 1.8 metres, below it. So basically, the armour belt is 64.9 metres long by roughly, and he says roughly, 6.7 metres high. The guns on the main deck were protected from raking fire by a 4.5-inch transverse bulk decks, but the bulkheads, and you will see those. I said bulk decks, bulkheads, and you will see those. I'll be talking about those when I walk through them. So that's what you're going to be seeing next. I'm going to be talking about the Citadel. And I hope you're enjoying this sort of intermix. There is a sort of both ends, as mentioned, and this is a problem with Citadels. Both ends are unprotected. They're subdivided into watertight compartments to minimise flooding, and there is subdivision going on in the ship to try and minimise flooding. But then you notice when you're going through the ship, there are huge cathedral-like spaces where you can see up and down. And they have to be, because people have to move, and they needed the air, and that was how they designed it at the time. But it does make it kind of interesting in terms of how the technology is moving on. What's interesting is you see what they understand, and I also see how starting down many paths which are leading to what we have today, but they haven't yet got there. And that's one of the things I love about going around HMS Warrior, and I find really, really cool about her preservation, that it shows so much of the process that was going on in the development of the engineering. Hope you enjoy. So, this is where you can really see the armoured citadel nature of HMS Warrior. You can see the iron and the thickness of the door. You can see the teak you can see the strength it provides. And then going in here, you can see what the whole frigate is built around. Everything is to do with this armoured part. This is what sets this ship apart. This is what allows it to take on, theoretically, ships of the line as being only a frigate and win. Because they have to fight that iron, fight that teak to get through to this, which is the fighting core of the ship. This is what will keep going and keep lasting. This is what gives it its 40 gun rating. This is what gives it its safety and command. When we look at the compass, we look at the entire wheel structure there. Everything here is about keeping a ship fighting in combat. HMS Warrior wasn't designed to win battles by pounding quickly and running away, although she had guns which could severely wreck you if she hit you. She was designed to win battles by outlasting you, by being the last ship standing and still going. That's her advantage, but that's also her role. Having firepower, engines, and armour is all very well, but if you don't have the crew to hold it all together, it isn't going to get you far. Now, some of HMS Warrior's crew go on to great and famous things. Some of them are already quite famous in their time. Her first captain comes from that Cochrane family, and I mean, really, that Cochrane family. Her last captain, of course, goes on to be Admiral Roebuck at the Dardanelles, a gentleman famous for not improvising really with his orders when he knew they weren't as good, but also not remonstrating about them when he knew they weren't as good. Definitely one of the products of the Victorian Navy, sadly enough. But then, of course, we have the other product of the Victorian Navy who was there dancing along for 14 months. Admiral Jackie Fisher. And by the way, to talk about the dancing, there is an interesting story. Before we get on to this, and in the outtakes you're going to see there's going to be a little video of some dancing at the end. And there's only one video of it because I was with two couples going around this ship doing the filming. Drac and Dr. Dan were delayed, so they didn't turn up, and so I had my normal film crew, Sam and Richard, who you've seen before, and I had Glyn and his partner, his wife, and Glyn Stewart, who was over here in the UK. And both couples did a little dancing. Sam and Richard went first. They of course got married this year, so they had lots of dancing practice, and they just did a little bit of dance on the dancing floor. And then Glyn and Jack went. And I actually got told afterwards by Sam, I'm not allowed to show their video of their dancing because they were just mucking around, and Glyn and his wife did it properly, in her words, and did it beautifully. And she would look very bad compared to them when she's done all the dance training she's done, and they did it properly. So, yeah. I'm not allowed to show that video on pain of my director / best friend / camera person / person who has similar level of inventiveness as myself probably trying to kill me. Anyway, the next load of clips are an assortment of clips from various parts of the ship where I'm talking a little bit about all the different features which are there to try and make the lives of the crew better than they would have been in the true age of sail, i.e. the Napoleonic Wars, and I hope you enjoyed them. They're all little bits. They're not really one whole thing I can talk about. One of them's a section about the Mangle. You know, that's not really something you can put into a wider section, but they're all in clips, and I thought you'd enjoy something about the crew. So here. So when you're designing a ship, there is never such a thing as a single-use space. In fact, if there is a single-use space, you're probably in the engines. In this space, we have the definition of multi-use, because it's where people would eat, where they would sleep, where they would fight, and where they'd store their guns and munitions. If you can see, there are guns down the side. Now, I'm not quite sure about the breech loader being here. Some of them were definitely down here, but I'd say they're probably more likely through there in the armoured section. But definitely 68 pounder would be here. But also, you can see the other fruits of mechanisation going on around me. We have got the pistols. necessary for officers, NCOs to be armed in boarding actions or if they're going ashore. We have a whole load of muskets, to an extent, rifles, all around us. They're slowly moving towards a bolt action system as time goes on. And we have swords, of course, which are even more important, because if you're going to do a boarding action, doing a boarding action without swords is just sad. We have the paymaster's office, which is the most important point of the ship according to people when they're going ashore, because frankly, you want to get paid. But going in here, we have what is probably my camera person's favourite space. Yes, if Sam would like to wave to you, she is on the camera again this year, as she is for most of our UK specials as the camera person. This room can be used as a dancing room, an entertaining suite, accommodations. It is of course part of the captain's suite of areas, and of course the dining room. So it's very important. And you want to look at the Christmas trees. Yeah, I have a director behind the camera who's doing hand signals. It's fun. I'll just borrow this a second. There is the director. Now, as you can see, this room also has the latest in heating technology. This has been designed specifically to try and heat the ship without causing it minimal fire risk. This is why it is designed the way it is, and why it has the protected covers here and here to try and minimize the risk of any of the coal sparks actually getting out. And you really should have seen the gymnastics that were just carried out by that camera. Now, as you can see here, some people have a really interesting bed companion. I know there is a case of some people make remarks about sleeping with their partners, but if this was your companion, I don't think you're going to win the arguments for who gets which side of the bed. But otherwise, very commodious accommodations. They get a good accommodation. You have the commander, who's the executive officer, over there, paymaster, and you have the captain's steward would have that space, which would be the kitchen and their accommodation. So all of this is space assigned to key people to keep him running the ship. So basically, this is all about making sure that this guy has access to all the information he needs if there's an emergency. They can go straight up those steps beyond a bit at the point where they need to command the ship from. He has the sailing commander, he has the commander, the person who deals with the crew, and he has the paymaster, so he can remind them who pays them, and he has the steward to make sure that he is fed, watered, and actually able to do his job. So, cutlass drill. When HMS Warrior comes about, cutlasses are still an important part of your use. Cutlasses are still an important part of how you fight, especially boarding actions. As you can see, there are some standard positions. Guard, and then we have the second guard to deal with someone trying to whack you down from above. This is to deal with someone trying to come from one side. And then we have the third guard, which is probably the more natural and the one we more normally expect, and it's definitely seen in pirate movies where they go, ah, like this, leaving themselves, of course, entirely open to be killed by someone just going stab. So, guard, and like that. Now you have cuts. But that's quite a big maneuver if you're considering a ship. You don't want to be doing that. So what you want to be doing is that, and that. Because if you use the full reach, that's fine here, but if I do that here and I go, yeah, I'm dead. But if I'm doing this, I have a chance. So the entire range of motion and procedure for fighting on a ship is different. It teaches people close quarter combat. And this is another reason why sailors actually get used a lot in the various wars of the late 19th century, the European wars, especially in sieges, because no one's quite as nasty as a sailor is in close quarter combat, i.e. as you get when you go into a city. Because soldiers are taught to fight in the open where it's lovely and spacious. Sailors are taught to fight in a place where your literal chance of dying depends on where a lump of iron is. Makes you different. At some points in time, they have had various guns upgraded out for the rifle parties. These are flintlock muskets, which were mass-produced for the Royal Navy, and they're one of the first articles of mass production. But there are points where they upgrade them, and by the end, you do have bolt-action rifles being and starting to appear on Warrior's crew. Now, Warrior really shows the changing nature of ships and of the crew, because this ship has a seaman's bathroom, if we look in here. It has these lovely wrangles for drying out clothes. I think that's the right word, isn't it? Wrangle?
Mangle.
Mangle. Yeah. It has these lovely mangles for drying out clothes. Really a great thing you want to put your clothes through, but it works. It even has a version of a washing machine, if you look at this one. Because theoretically, you could stick soap and water in there and run it around using the handles, and that would wash your clothes. So it's an early washing machine. And this is the engineer's bathroom. Now, the engineer's bathroom is separate for the sailors for two reasons. One, engineers are oily, smelly creatures and they're disgusting. Two, the important thing is that actually there is a difference between sailors and engineers. Engineers are people who work below decks, sailors are people who work above decks, and the two at the beginning of the period don't always get along. Hence the remark from a sailor to an engineer, oily, sweaty, smelly things, and an engineer would probably call a sailor someone who's a bit soft. It's fine. So, whilst there have been some things added in to deal with modern requirements, HMS Warrior is still very much as she looked when she was launched in the 1860s. She is still laid out. This is still a magazine and powder room. And this is a kit room. This is where all the crew had their kit locker. If you think about this, if you've ever been to school in the UK, you'll have had a locker like this for putting your stuff during PE and games. And it is the same system. This is where your Navy duffel bag goes, and in that you can keep all your stuff. It's kind of like the lockers on HMS Belfast and all the other ships when you go around. There always has to be some sort of space for a kit bag, for your equipment to go and for your personal stuff to be. Your personal clothing, your personal items that you need and want to look after. Also remember, this is quite far down in the ship. So if anything happens to the ship, this stuff is probably not going to survive. But your life is probably more important, we hope. But when you wander along here, you'll see that their numbers of their locker will be on the bag, along with their name. This allows it to be very easily worked out who goes where, which belongs to who. If your name is not on your bag and just a number, then the odds are you'll be very new to the crew and you haven't yet been issued, because they could stick a number on the bag before you got here. They couldn't stick a name on until they knew who you were. And this ship has a lot of subdivision. Again, it's part of the development of the watertight nature of ships and of the idea of using subdivision, using these sort of dividers to try and provide safety against sinking. They know they want to keep water out of the ship. They also know that if they can stop the water spreading around the ship, it will make it more survivable and less likely to sink. They're still working out quite how to do that and what the best ways are. And they'll still be working out how to do that when the Titanic happens and when other things happen, because it's not a quick process. It's a learning one.
Enjoyed that, and well, let's now get on to her actual service history. She doesn't have an active war career. She doesn't end up actually fighting, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because that's part of the reason why she's still around today. She goes on many tours for the Royal Navy. She is a big status ship for the Royal Navy going around Britain. After she's commissioned in 1861, she conducts her sea trials. She'd cost almost twice a contemporary wooden ship of the line's cost. Most of it in developing the technologies which they were using on her. Or rather, developing how to actually use those technologies they'd already developed and working out what exactly they're going to do to them. Because again, the Royal Navy had changed their minds as they were going on. But immediately, after she's had some changes from the trials, a lighter bowsprit, a shorter jib boom, and some provision of extra heads amidships, more loos, she was assigned to the Channel Squadron under the command of, as mentioned, Arthur Cochrane. In March 1863, she escorted the royal yacht that had brought Princess Alexandra of Denmark to marry the then Prince of Wales. The princess appreciated the conduct of the ship's crew and sent a personal message to Sir Michael Seymour, who was the admiral of the Channel Squadron at the time, that she was much pleased. Cochrane, knowing the value of words and the value of such praise, had the message engraved on a brass plate and fitted to the ship's wheel. It's interesting to note that now Princess Alexandra of Kent, her descendant, is now patron of the HMS Warrior 1860 Trust that actually maintains the ship to this day. Nice bit of history going on there. A really nice bit of history. In mid-1863, she, along with the Channel Fleet, toured British ports for 12 weeks. She received 300,000 visitors, including as many as 13,000 a day in one port. Whilst in Liverpool, she actually managed to rescue survivors of the Mersey Flat Mary Agnes. It's a small vessel wandering around the Mersey, and which had sunk in a collision with the Isle of Man Steam Picket Company's ship, Naval. Not good, but good for Warrior. And then had a refit in November 1864, during which the Armstrong guns, unsurprisingly, are removed. And she's given the latest rifled muzzle-loading guns. I can't think why. She then recommissioned in 1867 under Captain John Corbett, a distant relation, to relieve her sister, HMS Black Prince, who you can see here, who was currently at that time guardship at Queenstown. Instead, both her and her sister are called back because they're doing a fleet review, because the Khedive of Egypt and the Sultan of Turkey are both visiting Britain, and Britain needs to send a message. After the review, there is something kind of interesting. The Admiralty pays off the ship on the 24th of July, and then commissions it, again on the 25th, under Captain Henry Boyes. Now, I wouldn't be surprised if this is to change over crews. Now, let me explain. She was going to go and do guardship duties at Queenstown Land, which means you're going to have one level of crew. If you're going to change over the crew completely, you can either add in ad hoc additions if you're changing missions, or you can change the leadership and everything to reflect your next duties, and that is what I think they do. They send her to the Channel Squadron, and then she's deployed to Osborne Bay to guard Queen Victoria at Osborne House. Yeah, just in case the French get ideas of doing a snatch and grab on the Queen, there is usually at least one, if not two, first-rate ships of the Royal Navy sitting in Osborne Bay while the Queen's in residence, going, please, we wish you luck. And again, you can imagine the quality of crew which are selected for this role. Again, you have a choice. Escorting a princess, protecting the Queen. Are we going to pick a crew who aren't going to be capable of doing their job? And again, as I pointed out earlier, the Royal Navy has a trouble in this period, and I've discussed it in other videos, in that you can either put the money into building a navy and having it training constantly to be capable of fighting, but then it's not going to be as good for the present mission because it needs to maintain a certain image, a certain quality to look good. Again, I've discussed this in other videos. all sorts of videos, actually. There are so many videos where I've discussed it in presence, but basically any videos under the Admiral slash Command or Diplomacy of the watch lists, you will find videos discussing this and discussing the realities of this. This is going to be long enough as it is without me adding all that in. Those ships need to look good. And if they're going to look good, then exercising will actually make them look, will actually tend to cause a lot of dirt to build up. So you then should have a choice. Do you train and then spend a lot of time cleaning to get the ship to look good again? Or do you just focus a little less time on cleaning and don't do as much training in order to save money? Well, you always balance that off if you are going to have most of your Navy doing the Presence mission and concentrating on looking fierce and scary because they look all spick span polish, on having some ships which really do burn the candle at both ends because they are doing both. They are training hard and are also looking very good. And guess what those ships are going to be called on to do in peacetime? Oh, yes, we have to protect the Queen. Yeah. That's going to be one of those ships, one of those crews which the Admiralty knows. They spend the money, they spend the budget, they make sure they have the kind of captains who have no qualms with working their ship to the bone in a way that motivates the crew by giving them constant activity. Who basically motto is, carry on, Chief. Emphasis on the carry on, Chief. I'm for sure you were thinking of doing something. She then escorts the royal yacht to Dublin. She does all sorts of duties on that. Oh, and by the way, another threat, of course, to Queen Victoria was the Fenian movement, the Fenian Rising, the Irish nationalists at the time. And again, the idea was they might try and come by boat into Osborne Bay. In which case, well, HMS Warrior would have had a very short, very sharp live fire exercise. As far as the news would ever be told. While she was actually, well, after she'd escorted the royal yacht, and while she was actually sort of returning with that and cruising to Scotland in August, in 1868, she collided with HMS Royal Oak, losing her figurehead and jib boom and smashing Royal Oak's cutter. Boys is court-martialed, but acquitted over the incident, and has a fairly successful career after this. He goes on to senior rank. Then comes the highlight of her career as a serving ship. Towing a floating dry dock to Bermuda. Her sister, the wooden paddle frigate HMS Terrible, and her sail it across the Atlantic from Madeira to Bermuda. Why? So that the Royal Navy can operate ironclads and large vessels wherever they want to in the world. But it's not a permanently built one, so the Americans can't object as much. Her career continues much the same. And, well, she began a refit in 1871 that lasted till 1875. This added a poop deck, a steam capstan, finally, a shorter bowsprit and replacement boilers. The capstan is really quite useful because that finally means that the heaviest anchor ever to be lifted by human power alone no longer needs to be lifted by human power alone. During the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878, she's mobilized due to concerns the Russians might carry on to attack Constantinople, which Britain didn't want, because Britain didn't want the Russians getting control of the Dardanelles, because the Russians not controlling the Dardanelles is kind of useful to the British because it keeps them in the Black Sea. You know, realpolitik is beautiful. Luckily, though, the Russians didn't make it that far, so she went to Bantry Bay instead. It's always nice to visit Ireland, and Cork is particularly beautiful.
In April 1881, she transferred to the Clyde district, serving as guard ship till May 1883. At that point, roughly 2 of her masts were discovered to be rotten, and with no replacement available, the ship's decommissioned. In 1887, she is reclassified to a screw battleship, 3rd class armoured, and in May 1882, she's reclassified to a 1st class armoured cruiser, although no changes had been done to her, and in fact 1894 her modernisation is rejected as uneconomical after at least 1 new boiler was installed. She struck off the effective list and classified as a hulk in March 1900. The thing is, she's then used as a storage ship. And she's used as a hulk to support HMS Vernon, which was the Royal Navy's torpedo training school. One wonders if a certain lieutenant who used to serve on her a long time ago as a junior officer from HMS Excellent was protecting a ship he'd enjoyed dancing on. One does not know. But she does seem to lead a curiously charmed life, because she's still being used as such till after World War One's over. At which point, when all the obsolete ships are being scrapped after World War One, the demand for scrap iron is all filled. So when the Royal Navy tried to sell off Warrior in April 1925, no commercial interest in scrapping the old ship remained. And so she was at Portsmouth until 1929. Well, in 1927, she was modified into a mooring jetty. They just slowly worked on it, and this entailed removal of all her equipment, masts, and other than her boilers and generators, which had been installed in 1902, 1904. And she then is sort of slowly converted into pretty much a oil hulk, a floating oil jetty. And so that's what she does for the next 50 years. The ship lays offshore at an offshore from an oil depot at Lannan Cove. She even gets her top deck covered in concrete during one of her maintenance dockings before World War II. During the war, she serves as a base ship for coastal minesweepers, and in August 1942 was renamed Oil Fuel Hulk C-77. Why? Well, she's gone in and out of having her name HMS Warrior. She lost it for an armoured cruiser. At this point, she loses it for a light aircraft carrier, which was under construction time, the Colossus class vessel. During her service at Lannan Cove, it's estimated she refueled at least 5,000 ships. Or she carried out 5,000 refuelings. I'd say that's probably more likely. I don't think 5,000 ships went through Lannan Cove, but the actual specifics by the historian writing it aren't quite there. And it's only in the 1960s that they start to discuss restoring her. In 1967, the Greater London Council proposed to restore the ship as an attraction in London, but the Royal Navy required her still at Pembroke, and so the scheme went no further. In 1968, however, a royal gets involved. The Duke of Edinburgh himself chairs a meeting that discusses the preserving and restoring of Warrior and other historic vessels. A year later, 1969, the Maritime Trust is established to save the vessel and other historic ships. The Maritime Trust is significantly supported by the Manifold Trust, led by a then Conservative Member of Parliament, John Smith, maintaining a firm interest in Warrior. In 1976, after they've managed to get their finances and everything in order, they've had a few years to do so by this point,
a good 6-7 years of organising themselves, the Royal Navy announces that L'Annan Oil Depot would be closed in 1978. Manifold Trust begins to seek funds to restore her. And with the promise of financial support for restoration, and a very outspoken gentleman of the royal persuasion leaning on them quite heavily, the Royal Navy donated the ship to the Trust in 1979. And when I say leaning on him quite heavily, there are various rumours I've heard about it. I know a lot of people were involved. I know it's not down to him by any means alone. There is a huge group of people who we owe massive amounts of thanks to for this ship still being around. But it also doesn't hurt that this ship has kind of survived thanks to various levels of royal connections. The fact is the royal family have been very involved in Warrior's career for all of it and her survival. And so she donated, they got the ship in 1979. They acquired the ship's preservation trust, acquired ownership of the ship officially in 1983, and it became the Warrior Preservation Trust in 1985, which is looking after it pretty much to this day. She's part of the National Historic Fleet. She was looked after by the Preservation Trust until 2017. Then the trust is taken over and it's now a sub-part of the National Museum of the Royal Navy. Which, how do I put this? It's a concept which has come together recently in the last few years, and the architects involved are several sort of quite prominent Royal Navy officers who basically decided the only way you were going to preserve a lot of the smaller ships was if you brought all the museums and all the facilities together under one roof, and therefore were able to use the more prominent ones to kind of subsidise the others to an extent. It's been successful in parts, in other parts I think they are still making progress. It's been successful, but there is still progress to be made. It's an ambitious project. And when you're considering the geographical spread and the historical spread and the organisational spread of it, bringing it together is, in the heritage and culture arena, especially with COVID and all the other things that have hit since 2020, it's a Herculean task that you just have to give them respect for. The fact they're even trying it. You can see what was really here to propel HMS Warrior for a lot of her career. She is the bisection of two periods of technology. She is the age of sail, and she's the age of steam. Both come together in her. She has one of the most thought through, well put together and thought out sail plans of any ship ever designed. Not as the same as Cutty Sark's or something like that, but very good for a warship. And yet, at the same time, she also has an engine. She has the finest engine they could get at the time. So, I hope you enjoyed all that video. I hope you enjoyed the video. Usually I end the videos with a question. And I wanted to have an appropriate question for HMS Warrior. And so it's this. We often talk about which ships you'd like to see preserved from World War II or World War I. What ship that wasn't preserved would you like to see preserved from the 1860s? I know there are a couple on my list of the 1860s, 1870s, and 80s. There's the previous sort of ironclad sort of era pre-semi-dreadnought HMS Warspite, which I would have loved to have seen preserved. And I'd love to hear what you would have liked to see preserved. And what do we have coming up? Well, we have Battle of Coronel retrospect on the 6th of January. We have the live tomorrow of the Soviet Navy 1918 to 1991. Then I have the Ottoman and Venetian War on Saturday the 24th. That's going to be a recording. Then HMCS Hyder, which is going to be like this one, but with all the footage recorded
by the Canadian Naval History crew. And then it's the Albany class, Leahy class, and Belknap class to start off next week, before we get to the 100 years of gun cruisers. So we've done 3 classes of destroyer leaders, and then we get on to gun cruisers. And then we have the US nuclear powered cruisers on the 30th, Tickeronga class on the 31st. The brew ships on the 1st, by the way, I'm going to say now, is going to be a nice chat. But it's going to be me with Iron Brew chatting away and answering questions. It's not going to be a book review, because I honestly doubt I'm going to be, despite being a non-drinker, I doubt I'm going to be in a state to actually read books and answer with the books in front of me, especially where we're going to be. We're meeting up with family, we're doing things with family, and I could be doing it, broadcasting it from somewhere not at home. I could be out for a section that day. It's still up in the air exactly what the family are going to be doing that day, that week even, because more of us are free than we thought there was going to be. So family things happen. And then we have US treaty cruisers in war respect. And then we have the recorded of 100 years cruisers on Tuesday the 3rd. Then it's insect gun class gunboats on the 4th. Top 5 inventions that came too early on the 5th, and Battle of Coronel Live, and then the top 5 inventions that came too late to be useful on the 7th. And then more regular brew ships on the 8th. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and take care. And this is going to be a very long video. There are now going to be some various... well, I would normally do a blooper reel, but I'm actually going to just put a bit of dancing there, because they just dance so nicely. They did it really Jackie Fisher style, and I can see why my camera lady slash director slash best friend slash person who would hurt me if I put up the video of her dancing doesn't want hers up in comparison. Thank you very much to everyone who made it possible. Thank you very much to Portsmouth Dockyard, to the people who preserve HMS Warrior. Thank you, take care, and hope you enjoyed. Bye. Oh, I'm not doing this again. Or rather, I'm not redoing this end bit to fix that. Thank you, everyone. Now to the bloopers. Or rather, the dancing, not the